The wooden toothpick arrived on a Tuesday morning, nestled in a velvet-lined jewelry box like it was the crown jewels. No note, no explanation, just that single, perfectly carved piece of Douglas fir sitting there mocking me. My name is Frank Castellano, and 3 months ago I handed over $9 million worth of prime Oregon timberland to my stepson Jake. Not sold it, gave it, free and clear. The same land my grandfather cleared with his bare hands in 1923. The same acres that put food on our table through the Depression, paid for my kids' college, built the life I thought we were sharing. I raised that boy from the time he was 8 years old. Taught him to identify white oak from red oak just by the bark. Showed him how to read the growth rings, how to calculate board feet, how to respect the forest that kept our family fed for 3 generations. When his mother died 2 years ago, I promised her I'd take care of him, make him part of the legacy. That toothpick? That was his answer. His way of telling me exactly what he thought our 40-year relationship was worth. One tiny sliver of the empire I'd built with my own hands, whittled down to something you'd use to pick food from your teeth. But Jake made one critical mistake. He assumed I was just some old fool who'd roll over and die quietly. What he doesn't know yet is that I've been in the timber business for 50 years, and I didn't build a $9 million operation by being stupid or sentimental. That toothpick was the beginning of his education, and mine. Jake came into my life when I married his mother, Sarah, back in 1984. She was a widow with an 8-year-old boy who barely spoke above a whisper and flinched every time a door slammed. His biological father had been one of those weekend warriors who'd disappear into the Oregon wilderness for days, leaving Sarah to wonder if he'd come back or become another cautionary tale. One tiny sliver of the empire I'd built with my own hands, whittled down to something you'd use to pick food from your teeth. But Jake made one critical mistake. He assumed I was just some old fool who'd roll over and die quietly. What he doesn't know yet is that I've been in the timber business for 50 years, and I didn't build a $9 million operation by being stupid or sentimental. That toothpick was the beginning of his education, and mine. Jake came into my life when I married his mother, Sarah, back in 1984. She was a widow with an 8-year-old boy who barely spoke above a whisper and flinched every time a door slammed. His biological father had been one of those weekend warriors who'd disappear into the Oregon wilderness for days, leaving Sarah to wonder if he'd come back or become another cautionary tale. When Jake was 7, that question got answered permanently in a logging accident up near Mount Hood. Sarah worked double shifts at the Pendleton Woolen Mills just to keep their apartment in East Portland. When I met her at Murphy's Tavern, she was nursing a single beer she'd been making last 2 hours, too proud to let anyone buy her another round. That's the kind of woman she was, stubborn, independent, and carrying more weight than anyone should have to bear alone. My own kids, Michael and Lisa, were already grown and starting families of their own when I brought Sarah and Jake to the family compound in Timber Grove. The main house sits on 200 acres of old-growth forest with 3 smaller cabins scattered through the property that my grandfather built for seasonal workers. It's the kind of place where you can walk for an hour without seeing another soul, where the Douglas firs grow so tall they seem to pierce the clouds. Those first few years weren't easy. Jake was a city kid, thrust into a world where your worth was measured by how early you could get up, how hard you could work, and how well you could read the forest. My kids treated him like an outsider, making it clear at every family gathering that he wasn't real Castellano blood. I remember one Thanksgiving when Michael was showing off his new Dodge truck, going on about how it was perfect for hauling timber loads. When Jake asked if he could look under the hood, Michael laughed and said, "Maybe when you're old enough to afford your own sport. This is for people who actually work the land." The humiliation on Jake's face that day still haunts me. He was maybe 12, just trying to connect, and my own son cut him down like he was nothing. Sarah saw it too, and I watched something die in her eyes. After that, she stopped trying to make Jake fit into family events. Started keeping him closer to home, protecting him from the casual cruelty that seemed to follow him wherever he went in our world. But the worst incident happened when Jake was 15. We were hosting the annual Timber Grove Harvest Festival, a tradition my grandfather started, where all the local logging families would gather to share stories, compare equipment, and show off the year's best cuts. Jake had been working with me all summer, learning to operate the smaller equipment, proving he had the instincts for the business. I was proud of him and decided this would be his moment to shine. I set up a log-splitting demonstration, thinking it would show everyone that Jake belonged. He'd been practicing for weeks, had the technique down perfect. But when the moment came, with 50 people watching, the axe slipped. The log barely cracked. The crowd started murmuring, and I heard someone whisper, "City boys got no business trying to do a man's work." Jake's face went crimson. He tried again, swinging harder, desperate to prove himself. The axe bounced off completely this time, and actual laughter rippled through the crowd. That's when my nephew Tony called out, "Maybe stick to video games, Jake. Leave the real work to real loggers." I should have stepped in, should have shut Tony down and given Jake another chance. Instead, I froze, caught between loyalty to my family and protection of my stepson. Sarah didn't freeze. She marched into that circle, took the axe from Jake's trembling hands, and split that log clean through with one swing. The crowd went silent. Then she turned to Tony and said, "That's my boy you're laughing at, and if you've got something to say about how he was raised, you can say it to me." After that day, Jake never tried to prove himself to my family again. He retreated into himself, spending more time with Sarah and less time in the woods with me. But I kept trying to bridge that gap. Kept believing that if I just gave him enough opportunities, enough responsibility, eventually he'd find his place in the Castellano legacy. When Sarah got sick 2 years ago, Jake was already 28, working as my general manager and living in one of the family cabins with his girlfriend Emma. Sarah made me promise to treat him like my own blood, to make sure he'd always have a place in the family business. On her deathbed, she whispered, "He's earned his place, Frank. Don't let them take that away from him." That's when I decided to make the grand gesture. I deed him half the timberland outright, making him an equal partner instead of just an employee. Show my family and the whole Timber Grove community that Jake Castellano, that's the name he'd legally taken when he turned 18, was here to stay. The annual Castellano family reunion happens every 4th of July weekend at the main house. It's a 3-day affair that brings together 4 generations of loggers, mill workers, and timber barons from across the Pacific Northwest. This year was supposed to be special, the 50th anniversary of my grandfather's original land purchase, and I'd planned to use the occasion to announce Jake's inheritance. I'd spent weeks preparing the presentation, had the deed papers drawn up by our family lawyer Pete Kowalski, who'd been handling Castellano business since the 1970s. The plan was simple. After the traditional blessing of the tools ceremony on Sunday morning, I'd call everyone together and officially make Jake my heir to the timber operation. Equal partners, effective immediately. Emma had been helping with the preparations, and I could see the excitement in her eyes every time she looked at Jake. They'd been talking about marriage, about starting a family, about building a life together in Timber Grove. The land inheritance would make all of that possible. Jake would finally have the security and respect he'd been chasing his whole life. The weekend started normally enough. Michael and his family drove up from Salem in their new Winnebago, taking up half the main parking area like they owned the place. Lisa arrived with her husband Brad and their twin boys, immediately commandeering the best guest cabin and complaining about the cell phone reception. My brother Danny flew in from Seattle with his latest girlfriend, a woman 30 years younger, who kept asking if there was a spa nearby. Jake had taken charge of coordinating the whole event, and I was proud of how professionally he handled everything. He'd arranged for portable restrooms, hired a catering truck from McMinnville, even set up a small stage for the traditional storytelling competition. But I noticed the way my family treated his efforts. Michael walked right past the welcome table Jake had set up, not even acknowledging the work that had gone into organizing 75 people's accommodations. Lisa made snide comments about the fancy catered food, asking loudly if we were too good for Sarah's potato salad now. The first real tension erupted Friday night during the equipment showcase. It's a tradition where the men display their newest chainsaws, log splitters, and heavy machinery. Jake had just purchased a new Stihl MS-881, a professional-grade saw that cost more than most people's cars. He was explaining the technical specifications to some of the younger cousins when Tony interrupted. "Mighty expensive toy for someone who's never felled a real tree," Tony said, loud enough for half the gathering to hear. "That saw's got more power than some of the mills I worked in. Hope you know what you're doing with it, city boy." Jake's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Actually, I've been working these woods for 20 years now, Tony." "I think I can handle a chainsaw." 20 years? Tony laughed, taking a swig from his beer bottle. "I've got work boots older than your experience. Playing in the family sandbox doesn't make you a real logger." That's when Michael decided to pile on. "Dad's been real generous letting you learn the business, Jake, but there's a difference between playing lumberjack and actually running an operation this size. Takes generations of knowledge, takes understanding the land in your bones." I should have shut it down right there. Should have reminded them that Jake had increased our profit margins by 30% over the last 3 years, that he'd negotiated contracts with buyers I'd never even heard of, that he understood sustainable forestry practices better than any of us old-timers. Instead, I watched Jake's face close off, watched him retreat into that same defensive shell I'd seen too many times before. Emma appeared at Jake's side, her hand finding his elbow. "The saw's beautiful, Jake. You'll have to show me how it works tomorrow." But the damage was already done. I could see it in the way Jake's shoulders set, in the careful distance he maintained from the group for the rest of the evening. He'd been counting on this weekend to finally claim his place in the family. Instead, it was turning into the same old pattern of exclusion and subtle humiliation. Saturday brought the traditional logging competition: tree felling, log rolling, axe throwing. Jake had been practicing for months, determined to prove himself once and for all. He'd even convinced some of the local professionals to coach him, guys who worked the timber sales up in the Cascade Range. But when it came time to compete, Michael made a show of dividing everyone into teams based on family bloodlines. "We'll keep it fair," he announced to the gathering. "Castellanos versus everyone else. That way, the real family can show how it's done." Jake stood there for a moment, realizing he'd been deliberately excluded from his own family's team. The message was crystal clear: blood trumps 20 years of dedication. Emma's face went white with anger, but Jake just nodded and walked away, saying he had to check on the catering setup. That night, I found him sitting alone on the porch of his cabin, staring out at the forest that had been his whole life for 2 decades. "Tomorrow's the day," I told him, settling into the chair beside him. Once I make that announcement, all this nonsense ends. You'll be an owner, not just an employee, equal partner in everything." Jake turned to look at me, and for just a moment I saw something in his eyes I couldn't quite read. "You really think that's going to change anything, Frank? You think a piece of paper is going to make them see me differently?" "I think it's going to make you see yourself differently," I said, "and sometimes that's all that matters." He was quiet for a long time after that. Finally, he said, "I appreciate everything you've done for me, everything you and Sarah built here. I want you to know that." It sounded like gratitude, but something about the way he said it made my chest tighten, like he was saying goodbye instead of hello. Sunday morning arrived with that crisp Oregon clarity that makes the Douglas firs look like they're reaching straight into heaven. The blessing of the tools ceremony is sacred in our family. Every chainsaw, every axe, every piece of equipment that keeps us connected to the land gets blessed for another year of safe, productive work. My grandfather started the tradition, believing that respect for your tools meant respect for the forest that fed your family. 75 people gathered in the main clearing, 3 generations of loggers holding their most prized equipment. Jake stood near the back with his new still, looking more nervous than I'd seen him since he was a kid. Emma squeezed his hand, whispering something that made him nod and straighten his shoulders. After Reverend Mackenzie finished the blessing, I stepped forward to address the crowd. This was it, the moment I'd been planning for months. The moment Jake would finally get the recognition he deserved. "Family," I began, my voice carrying across the clearing. 50 years ago, my grandfather Giuseppe Castellano took a leap of faith and purchased this land with every penny he had. Today, I want to honor that legacy by ensuring it continues for another 50 years. I could see Jake's face from where I stood, watched him shift his weight from one foot to the other. Emma was practically glowing with anticipation. Jake Castellano has worked beside me for 20 years. He's learned every inch of these woods, every aspect of the business, and he's earned his place as my successor. Today, I'm proud to announce that I'm deeding him half of our timber operation, making him an equal partner in Castellano Forestry. The silence that followed wasn't the stunned amazement I'd expected. It was something colder, more calculating. Michael stepped forward, his face flushed red with what I initially thought was emotion. "Dad, we need to talk, privately." "This is family business, Michael. Everyone here is family." "No," Michael said, his voice getting louder. "Everyone here isn't family, and that's exactly the problem." He turned to face Jake directly, and I saw something cruel in his expression that reminded me of his mother's worst moments. "You want to know what family is, Jake. Family is blood. Family is sacrifice. Family is watching your father work 16-hour days to build something real, something lasting. Not showing up when you're 8 years old and expecting to inherit what 3 generations bled for." Jake's face had gone completely still, but I could see his knuckles white where he gripped the chainsaw handle. "I've worked for every opportunity Frank's given me. I've earned my place here." "Earned?" Lisa jumped in, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You've been playing house with our father's guilt money. You want to see earned? Ask Michael about the summers he spent hauling logs when he was 12. Ask me about working the mill scales when I was 15, breathing sawdust for 10 hours a day so this operation could expand." The crowd was shifting uncomfortably now, family members choosing sides with their positioning. I could see the old-timers nodding along with Michael and Lisa, while the younger generation looked increasingly uncomfortable. "That's enough," I said, stepping between my children and Jake. "I've made my decision. The papers are already signed." That's when Michael played his trump card. "Are they, Dad? Because I had an interesting conversation with Pete Kowalski yesterday.
Turns out the deed transfer requires unanimous family approval for any inheritance over $5 million. Mom's will was very specific about that. My blood turned to ice. Margaret's will. I'd forgotten about that clause. She'd insisted on it after watching too many family businesses torn apart by inheritance disputes. I'd been so focused on the gesture, so determined to give Jake his due, that I'd ignored the legal requirements. "The family vote is 3-1 against," Lisa announced with satisfaction. "Michael, me, and Danny all say no. You don't get to give away our children's inheritance to an outsider." Jake looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not hurt, not angry, but something much more dangerous. Disappointment so deep it had calcified into contempt. "An outsider," he repeated quietly. "After 20 years, I'm still an outsider." "Jake," I started, but he held up his hand. "No, Frank, they're right. I'm not blood. I'll never be blood. And apparently that's all that matters here." He walked over to where his new chainsaw sat among the blessed tools, picked it up, and started it with one smooth pull. The still roared to life, its professional-grade engine drowning out every other sound in the clearing. Then Jake did something that will haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. He walked over to the old oak tree where my grandfather had carved the family name in 1923, held that chainsaw against the bark, and began systematically destroying every letter. "Jake, stop!" I shouted over the noise, but he kept cutting, sawdust flying as he obliterated 90 years of family history. When he finished, he shut off the saw and looked directly at me. "There, now you don't have to worry about an outsider disrespecting the family name." He handed me the chainsaw, its blade still warm from the cutting. "Consider this my resignation from Castellano Forestry, effective immediately." Then he walked away, Emma hurrying to catch up with him, leaving me standing in front of 75 people holding the evidence of his final statement about what our 20-year relationship had meant to him. The crowd began to disperse in uncomfortable silence. Michael clapped me on the shoulder like he'd just saved me from making a terrible mistake. "You'll thank us for this someday, Dad. Family businesses have to stay in the family." But as I watched Jake and Emma load their belongings into their truck and drive away from the only home he'd known for 2 decades, I realized that my real family, the people who'd actually chosen to be here, who'd worked to build something together, had just walked out of my life forever. The aftermath hit like a controlled burn that suddenly jumps the firebreak.
Within hours of Jake's departure, word spread through Timber Grove faster than wildfire. By Monday morning, 3 of our biggest contracts had been put under review. By Tuesday, I learned why. Jake hadn't just been my general manager. He'd been the face of our operation to the outside world. Modern buyers wanted someone who understood sustainable forestry, carbon credit programs, and environmental impact assessments. They wanted Jake's expertise, not my old-school methods. When he walked away, he took 20 years of relationships with him. Pete Kowalski showed up at my house Wednesday morning with a stack of papers and a grim expression. "Frank, we need to discuss your legal situation. Jake's been asking questions about his contract termination, and there are some complications you need to know about." Turns out, Jake's employment agreement, which I'd barely glanced at when Pete drafted it 5 years ago, included intellectual property clauses. Every forestry management system he'd developed, every buyer relationship he'd cultivated, every efficiency improvement he'd implemented, legally, it all belonged to him, not the company. "He's not trying to destroy you," Pete explained, "but he's within his rights to start his own operation using the methods he'd developed while working for you. And Frank, half your buyer network has already reached out to him about exclusive contracts." That's when I realized Jake's resignation hadn't been an emotional outburst. It had been a strategic withdrawal. While I'd been planning to make him a partner, he'd been planning to become my competitor. The real blow came Thursday when I got the call from Emma. Jake had made an offer on the old Henderson timber tract, 3,000 acres of prime Douglas fir that bordered our property to the south. The Hendersons had been talking about selling for years, but I'd always assumed I'd get first refusal. Family connections, neighborhood loyalty, all that. Frank, Emma's voice was careful, professional. Jake wanted me to call you directly. He's starting Pacific Northwest Sustainable Forestry, and he wants you to know he's not trying to hurt you personally. This is just business. Business? I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice. 20 years of working side by side, and now it's just business? What did you expect? Emma's composure cracked slightly. You let your children humiliate him in front of 75 people. You promised him partnership and then stood there while they called him an outsider. Did you really think he'd just disappear quietly? She was right, and we both knew it. Jake had learned more from me than just forestry techniques. He'd learned how to recognize when someone was undervaluing him, and he'd learned how to respond with precision rather than emotion. The Henderson deal went through within 2 weeks. Jake had financing lined up, environmental permits pre-approved, and buyer contracts already negotiated. I'd taught him well, maybe too well. Michael tried to spin it as a positive development. Good riddance, he said when I told him about Jake's new operation. Now we can run things the right way, the family way, without having to pretend that charity case belonged here. But the numbers didn't lie. Within a month of Jake's departure, Castellano Forestry's profit margins dropped by 40%. The sustainable forestry certifications he'd maintained started lapsing. Buyer after buyer chose Jake's operation over ours, citing better environmental practices and more competitive pricing. Lisa finally admitted what I'd been afraid to face. Dad, we might need to consider selling off some of the peripheral land, just to maintain cash flow while we rebuild the operation. Selling land? In 3 generations of Castellano ownership, we'd never sold a single acre. We'd bought, we'd expanded, we'd built. We never retreated. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I drove to Jake's new office, a converted barn on the Henderson property that he'd transformed into a surprisingly professional operations center. Emma met me at the door, her expression wary but not hostile. "He's in the field," she said, "but I can get him on the radio if this is important." It's important. 20 minutes later, Jake emerged from the forest looking every inch the successful timber baron I'd trained him to be. Professional gear, confident stride, the bearing of someone who belonged exactly where he was. "Frank." His greeting was polite but cold. "What can I do for you?" "You can listen," I said, "and you can let an old man admit when he's been wrong." We talked for 3 hours. Not about business, not about contracts or profits or family politics. We talked about what it means to build something lasting, about the difference between legacy and inheritance, about the courage it takes to walk away from everything familiar to build something true. Jake didn't forgive me. I didn't expect him to. But he listened, and more importantly, he understood that my failure hadn't been about love or loyalty. It had been about cowardice, about choosing the easy path of keeping peace with my blood family instead of fighting for the family I'd chosen. "The land should have been yours," I told him as I prepared to leave. "Not half of it, all of it. You're the only one who ever understood what it means." "I know," Jake said simply. "That's why I'm building my own." 2 months later, I made another decision that sent shockwaves through the family. I put Castellano Forestry up for sale, not to an outside buyer, but to Jake's operation. The offer was generous, but not sentimental. Fair market value for the land, equipment, and remaining contracts. Michael and Lisa threatened legal action, accused me of senility, even staged an intervention with cousins flying in from 3 states. But the truth was simple. Jake had proven he could run a forestry operation better than any of us. He deserved the chance to run the one he'd spent 20 years helping to build. The unexpected twist came during the final contract negotiations. Jake's lawyer presented a modification to the purchase agreement that none of us saw coming. Instead of buying Castellano Forestry outright, Jake proposed a merger. Pacific Northwest Sustainable Forestry would absorb our operation, but I would retain a 25% ownership stake and the title of senior advisor. Why? I asked him after the lawyers had left. Jake looked out at the forest where he'd learned to read growth rings and calculate board feet, where he'd spent 20 years trying to earn his place. Because this land made me who I am, and despite everything, you're the one who taught me to respect it. The merger went through on the anniversary of Sarah's death. Emma and Jake were married in a simple ceremony under the old oak tree, the same one where he'd cut away our family name, and where new bark was already growing over the scars. Michael and Lisa got their inheritance after all, just not in the way they expected. Their shares of the sale gave them enough money to start their own ventures, though neither chose to stay in the timber business. They'd wanted the financial legacy without understanding that the real inheritance had always been knowledge, respect, and love for the land itself. As for the grand gesture I'd planned, making Jake a partner, it turned out he didn't need my permission after all. He'd become something better than a partner. He'd become a worthy successor, someone who'd earned his place not through blood or sentiment, but through competence, vision, and the courage to walk away when he wasn't valued properly.
Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't what they want, but what they need to become who they're meant to be. That wooden toothpick sits on my desk now, right next to the signed merger documents that made Jake the majority owner of what's become the most successful sustainable forestry operation in the Pacific Northwest. What I thought was an insult turned out to be something else entirely, a reminder of how small my thinking had been. Jake didn't send me that toothpick to mock me. He sent it to show me what he could build from the smallest piece of what I'd given him. One sliver of Douglas fir, carved with the same precision he brought to everything else, transformed into something beautiful and purposeful. It was his way of saying thank you, and his way of saying goodbye to the man who'd needed his validation. I'm 77 now, and I spend my days teaching Jake's crew about old-growth identification and sustainable harvesting techniques that my grandfather learned from the Chinook tribes who worked these forests for centuries. The young loggers call me Professor Frank, and they listen when I talk about respecting the land that feeds you. Emma gave birth to their first child last month, a daughter they named Sarah. When I held her for the first time, Jake said something that stays with me. She'll grow up knowing she belongs here, not because of whose blood runs in her veins, but because of whose values guide her hands. The Castellano name is gone from the business now, but the Castellano values live on in ways my grandfather never could have imagined. Sometimes legacy isn't about keeping everything exactly the same. Sometimes it's about teaching someone to honor what matters most and having the wisdom to get out of their way. That toothpick taught me that the smallest gesture, given with the right heart, can carry more meaning than the grandest inheritance. And sometimes the greatest gift a father can give his son isn't land or money or even recognition. It's the freedom to build something entirely his own. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever struggled with what it means to honor the past while building the future, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories about family, legacy, and the courage it takes to do what's right even when it's hard, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the mistakes we're brave enough to admit and the wisdom we're humble enough to share.